This happened about 10 years ago, and even now it gives me chills every time I think about it. At the time, my ex-wife and I had just gotten married and moved into a new neighborhood. We'd settled into the house during the winter, and when spring arrived, the snow melted to reveal a disturbing pattern. There were dead animals in our yard. A few birds and squirrels were scattered throughout. It wasn't just one or two. They were enough to make me pause. It was a bit shocking to see, but we cleaned them up and chalked it up to a harsh winter, since the weather had been more unforgiving than usual. Though the unease lingered in the back of my mind. Determined to make the house feel like ours, we threw ourselves into some home improvement projects. We painted the walls, landscaped the yard, and tried to ignore an odd feeling that seemed to hang over the place. It was a new house and we were trying to settle in, but there was just something about it. It started small. Keys and other random items would go missing, only to turn up later in places we were sure we hadn't left them. For myself, I brushed it off as forgetfulness, but soon it escalated. As I lay in bed, I began to notice faint noises. It sounded like a barely audible conversation, almost as though a distant radio was playing in another room. Whenever I tried to focus on it, the sound would vanish. Same thing happened with footfalls. They were faint but deliberate, always as if they were coming from the opposite sides of the house that I was hearing it from. Then came the night where these subtle events turned into downright nightmare fuel. I was jolted awake by a loud crash. I got out of bed and went to investigate. In the kitchen, I found our son's hamster cage lying on the floor, 15 feet from where it had been. We always placed it on top of the fridge at night to keep it out of reach of our cat, but the cage's resting place made no sense. It had somehow flown over a breakfast bar and a kitchen table. Our cat wasn't capable of that. It was from that point on, things became darker. I would sit at home trying to relax, but this overwhelming thought began to worm its way into my mind. What would it be like to be possessed? At first, I dismissed it completely, as the thought itself was disturbing, but it persisted. Intrusive thoughts like this eventually consumed me. I couldn't concentrate on anything else when I was in that house. The only way to push it out was to repeat small prayers in my head. I wasn't even a religious person, but it was the only thing that seemed to break the grip those thoughts had on me. Oddly enough, the moment I left the house, those thoughts disappeared. It was like a switch being flipped. But the second I pulled into the driveway, that awful feeling would return. And so would they. I started to believe I was losing my mind. Yet when I finally worked up the courage to confide in my wife, everything shifted. I remember sitting down with her one evening, trying to explain what I'd been going through. Before I could get far, she turned pale. I began by saying I thought I was going crazy, because I'd been having these weird thoughts. I couldn't even say anything else, because she finished my sentence, replying, "That you want to be possessed?" There was a long and deafening silence in the room after she said that. We eventually began comparing experiences. She told me about the days when I wasn't home, how she'd hear a man's voice whispering through the baby monitor while our child fussed. Her voice trembled as she described how she felt paralyzed, unable to move or react. It was out of fear of sounding crazy or not being believed. So she swept that under the rug in hopes it wasn't anything serious. When she told me that was all it took. We moved out within the month, ate the deposit. Her eldest daughter was still in school and would get dropped off by the bus at the old place. I would drive there to pick her up, and every time, As soon as I turned the corner onto that street, those thoughts would start, as if on cue. I don't know if it was something psychological at that point, as if I was expecting it because of what happened in the home, but I know for a fact it did not start that way. I truly think something was trying to take control of us, and there was no way in hell we were going to stay to find out. I think it's finally time to let this story out. I'm a proud guy, far too proud to admit that ghosts exist, let alone that they could scare me. But for 2 months last year, I swear I was haunted, and not in some small, laugh-it-off kind of way. It all started around last Christmas, when I picked up a Ouija board at a thrift store filled with oddities. It wasn't even planned. I was actually just checking the place out for fun when I saw it sitting on a dusty shelf, surrounded by old VHS tapes and yellowed books. For some reason, I felt compelled to take it home. Maybe that should have been the first red flag. I know some of you are thinking how dumb I was for doing so, and I hate to admit you're right. I never bought into the whole Ouija board thing. To me, it was nothing more than a fake board game claiming to open up the spirit realm. Nothing actually serious. My friends refused to interact with it, and I waved off their superstitions. It wasn't real anyway. So in full confidence and a hefty amount of bravery, not only did I take this thing home, but I decided to try it. Alone. It was a bitterly cold December night, snow falling outside my window in soft, lazy flakes. I decided to light some candles for some extra ambience as I set the board on my desk. I placed my hands on the planchette, feeling equal parts foolish and curious, but I was so confident that nothing would happen. And at first, nothing did. I asked the usual generic questions. A short bit went by when the air in the room seemed to shift. It grew heavier, thicker, almost suffocating. That was when the planchette began to move, and I admit, I jolted with shock. I kept my hands on it as it began to spell F-A-K-E. Fake. A stubborn part of me refused to acknowledge what was happening. I saw this as nothing more than a game, but this supposed reply seemed aware, almost mocking. It had to be my subconscious at play, my own hands guiding the planchette in some way. But the oppressive weight in the room and my now tingling nerves suggested otherwise. With that, I packed away the board quickly, continuing to tell myself it was just a silly game, that I let my imagination get the better of me. And with that, I tried to forget about it. It was just an experience anyway. But then the events began to take place. I would wake up around 3 or 4 a.m., drenched in sweat, my heart pounding for no reason. I'd lie in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, convinced I could feel someone watching me. I reasoned it away. Bad dreams, too much caffeine, stress from the holidays. Then almost a couple weeks later, I awoke to something I'll never forget. I still remember vividly. It was around 3:15 a.m. when I shot awake to the sound of screaming. It was horrible, guttural, like someone being torn apart. The sound echoed through the house, followed by a loud but muffled thud, like a body collapsing onto the floor. My heart was in my throat, and I legitimately thought a crime had somehow just happened in my home. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed, and I bolted out into the hallway. My entire body was shaking, the adrenaline making my hands unsteady. The house was dead silent. All the doors were closed. Lights were off. I checked every room, but there was no sign of anything or anyone. but the feeling of being watched lingered, and it was stronger than ever. It was as if something was standing right behind me, its breath brushing the back of my neck. My skin crawled with the sensation, and I hurried back to my room, locking the door behind me. That night marked the end of my normal sleep schedule. I started staying up till about almost 6 in the morning, sitting in my room with the lights on, trying to distract myself with video games. My body was under endless stress and a lack of sleep. Despite my efforts, the ghost hour found me anyway. It all came to a head one night in early January, 2 days after New Year's. I was in the middle of playing Call of Duty when it happened. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the furnace and the clicking of my controller. Out of nowhere, this chill crept up my back. It was so cold it felt almost like a burn, starting at the base of my neck and crawling to my left shoulder. I stopped breathing as that sensation spread to the side of my head. Then I felt it, the weight of something pressing down on my shoulder. It wasn't just cold. It felt like someone's head was leaning on me, as if they were dead weighting against me. It was then that my entire body locked up. I was frozen in place. The sound of breathing then filled my ear, low and rasping. It felt like ages before I finally snapped. My fight or flight response kicked in, and I shot up from my chair, swinging my arms wildly at nothing but emptiness. My heart was hammering in my chest again, my breathing ragged and panicked. The oppressive weight lifted immediately, leaving the room eerily still. I never touched that Ouija board again, or another one. In fact, I got rid of it the next day, and that was the first time I ever researched how to cleanse a home. I don't know if it was a ghost, a demon, or just my own mind unraveling, but I do know now that some doors are meant to stay closed. About a year ago, we moved into a house in a rural area. It was the kind of place you'd imagine when picturing peace and quiet. Woods, open fields, the occasional cattle spotted in the distance. Not long after we settled in, something strange happened. It was during winter, not long before the holidays, probably around 9 or so in the night. The temperature hovered in the mid to low 30s, and the night was calm and clear. There wasn't much snow, and there was no ice to crunch underfoot, just the kind of stillness that made you stop and appreciate the quiet. I had taken my collie Pax outside before bed to let him do his business. Pax had always been my shadow, and his presence was usually enough to make me feel at ease no matter where I was. That night, as he sniffed around the yard, I stood there for a moment, soaking in the serenity, until from the side of the house, I heard the soft melodic sound of wind chimes. They sounded calming. I was relaxed and listening to them, sort of in a trance as I still admired the night sky. It wasn't until almost a few minutes of this where I suddenly stopped. It was like a pang of realization hit me, an odd and almost fearful one. My body began to buzz, as if reacting before my mind could even fully catch up. We didn't have any wind chimes. I felt a sudden need to retreat, as if I was being watched from the dark edges of the yard. I called for Pax with a sharp urgency, hurried back inside and locked the door behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was skulking around the property. That wasn't the only strange thing about living in that area, though, no matter how much that experience might stand out. Sometimes when driving down the narrowly wooded roads, I'd see lights in the distance, headlights, or what looked like them. They'd appear to be crossing the road up ahead, as though a car was passing through an intersection. But as I got closer, there would be no intersection, no crossroad, and no sign of any car. Just an unbroken stretch of forest on either side. Other times I'd see headlights coming right toward me. They would disappear as they dipped down over a hill. But when I crested the hill, there would be nothing. No car once again. No turnoffs for anyone to have gone. Just empty road and the dark woods surrounding it. It really makes you wonder what might be hiding in the trees. There's something unnerving about the idea of untouched wilderness. What could be living out there, tucked away where people rarely go? But where I live, those wild places are slowly shrinking over time. Civilization creeps closer every year, carving away the land and forcing whatever's out there into smaller patches of forest. Sometimes I tend to think about it, about how those things that once roamed freely might feel now. Those energies, past places of history, how they're boxed in, crowded by things unfamiliar to them. I wouldn't be surprised if they're unhappy about it.